So I've had a bunch of you message me about doing a video about Indian whiskey. And I know a lot of you who actually watch this channel are from India from the YouTube stats. So grab a dram, grab a seat, and let's... So what even is Indian whiskey? Well, Indian whiskey is made from fermented molasses, and then it's sort of blended with other types of grains like maize, rye, barley, and wheat. And it's a huge industry. I think India is the third biggest consumer of whiskey worldwide, and one of their brands, Officer's Choice, sold like a whopping 400 million bottles in 2015. However, the majority of their whiskey, the fermented molasses made whiskey, can't actually be classed as whiskey internationally, and that's because it doesn't meet the standards of other types of whiskies worldwide. First of all, it's made from fermented molasses, which is more akin to rum, and also it's often not matured for the right amount of time. Like for Scotch whiskey to be called whiskey, it has to be aged in a barrel for a minimum of 3 years, and the same with Irish whiskey. However, there are some Indian whiskies that do meet the international requirements to be called whiskey, and they are India's single malts. So some of you might not even know what a single malt whiskey is, and well, basically it's a whiskey that comes from a single distillery and also from malted barley. And if you're sort of new to whiskey and you're just starting out and you're trying to get your head around it all, go watch my video on what is a single malt. That can kind of help you differentiate between different types of whiskies, and just give you a bit more guidance when you go into the supermarket or you go into the bottle store and you're trying to buy yourself a whiskey. But how is Indian single malt whiskey made? So to be able to be sold as whiskey in the EU and elsewhere, Indian whiskey has to be made the same way as Scotch single malt, made with malted barley in pot stills and then aged for a minimum of 3 years in oak. And that's what Amrut did in 2004. So I've got a couple of little samples here from that distillery. So Amrut are a producer of the traditional type of whiskey for a very long time. They're based out of Bangalore in India. And what happened was they had an excess of whiskey that was made from malted barley that had been aged in barrels for too long, which didn't really fit into their blends, what they normally do with the traditional Indian whiskey. And so they released a single malt named Amrut. And then Jim Murray, who does like the Whiskey Bible and stuff, he then gave it a favourable score in 2005, and then from then on it was on the map, and people started to really explore Indian single malt. While single malt wasn't really popular in India itself at the time, it did open up a door for Amrut to enter the international stage and export that whiskey. And so they were sort of experimenting with different types of distillation and different types of aging techniques, which a lot of them got onto the world stage, and that kind of attracted other new distilleries to start up, like a few you might have heard of, Paul John and Rampur. And I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but just giving it a shot. And each of these whiskies we're going to talk about at the end of the video. However, there's always new single malts starting up within India, and one of those is Kamet, and it's based after Mount Kamet, which is like one of the highest mountains in India, and it's on the foothills of the Himalayas. Also as well, they use Indian barley, Indian 6-row barley, so quite different to Scotch barley. That's a distillery to look out for, keep an eye on. I've actually never tried it. I mean, I don't even know if it's good, but it's interesting to see all these new single malts starting up in India, and yeah, it's an exciting time for whiskey. So let's talk about India's climate and terroir. And as I said before, barley's got its own unique variety of barley. However, it's normally grown at the very north of India, normally along the borders of China, Pakistan, and Nepal. And that's because barley thrives in a cooler climate. And so what that means for distilleries like Amrut and Paul John is that they have to then transport the barley all the way down about 1,500 miles to the distilleries. And then for peated whiskies like the Amrut, they were to import some of the peat, they would have to import that directly from Scotland. So then the question is, isn't it too hot in India to even make whiskey? Well, actually, it's probably not as hot as you think. So with Amrut in Bangalore, it's kind of in summer it can get around to 35 degrees Celsius. And then with Rampur, it gets to about 31 degrees, and then Paul John gets to about a degree less than that, and that's because of the maritime climate. So when you look at it, it's actually around the same as Tennessee and Kentucky, where a lot of bourbon's been made. It's probably too hot for me personally to live, but it's not like extreme desert kind of conditions. But the question then is, isn't India too dry? And this is probably the biggest obstacle Indian whiskey faces, because the humidity is so low in the air. In a whiskey barrel, what happens when it's really dry on the outside of the barrel, the water really wants to evaporate and get out. And so the water starts to escape through the barrel first, which means what's remained in the barrel is the alcohol, and then that starts to rise, so the ABV can go up when it's in the barrel, just like American whiskey. Whereas in Scotch, because the humidity is so high outside the barrel, the alcohol is the first thing to evaporate, and what they call the angel share, and the water will remain, so the ABV in a Scotch barrel will start to go down over time. However, Scotch barrels, it happens much slower. An Indian barrel ages fast. Basically, a 3-year-old Indian whiskey will be the equivalent of a 18-year-old Scotch whiskey. So that's where the dramatic differences lie, in the maturing of the spirit in the cask. So that's probably where you're going to get the key differences in flavour and nuance between the two countries. So let's get to the important part, tasting the whiskey. And Indian whiskies, to generalise, a bit like the whiskey regions in Scotland video I did, you can't actually really generalise because there's always exceptions to the rule, but to generalise, they're often tropical, they're often fruity, they're often quite youthful. And when I asked you guys on Instagram about, what Indian whiskies do you recommend, there's 3 whiskies that keep popping up. They were the Rampur, they were the Paul John, and they were the Amrut. And I got a few mixed responses as well. Some people said they were some of the best whiskies they'd had among some of the best Scotches and best Irish whiskies they've had. And then other people said, well, going back to the sort of the dry climate thing, because the Indian whiskey's aging process is so fast, it means they're spending less time in the barrel, and there's more to whiskey than just the spirit to barrel contact. There's other stuff that happens, like the oxidization and the decomposition, stuff that takes a long time in the barrel that Indian whiskey misses out on because of the really dry climate. And so some people found it a bit sharp, but other people love it. They completely love it. So really, what you got to do is you got to listen to your palate. It's up to you. You've got to go out there, try these whiskies, and decide for yourself on the nose, the palate, and the finish. And there's definitely some whiskies that I tried that are absolutely fantastic, which is what we'll get into now. So let's try some Indian whiskey. So the first whiskey I want to talk about is the Amrut distillery. And as we sort of talked about them a little bit before, but they come from the Amrut laboratories, and they go back to 1948, where, and they're sort of been known to make more of the traditional Indian whiskey with molasses and all that sort of thing, and more recently with single malt whiskey. They get the water from really deep wells under the ground, and the fusion is a mixture of, they get peated malt from Scotland, and they get barley from the north of India up by the Himalayas, and they mix them together for a fusion. They get a mixture between Indian and Scotch flavours. And then you've got the peated Indian whiskey, which imports the peated kind of malt from Scotland, and then they age it, in Bangalore, and it's sort of like 3,000 feet above sea level. So both 2 interesting whiskies, and let's have a try of them right now. So let's start off with the Amrut Fusion. And so straight off I'm getting some lemon zest, orangey notes, toffee, sort of a bit of licorice as well. And on the palate, tropical notes, some dried apricot. Now that I've tried that, what I normally do with whiskey is that you often will try it, see what it's like on the palate, and then add some water, because often water can open it up and change the sort of the compounds of the whiskey. And some whiskies are better without water, some whiskies are better with water. So with this whiskey, it being 50%, it'll be interesting to see what a few drops of water does to this whiskey. So I've got my little water jug. Yeah, that's much smoother. It's actually, the water has kind of reduced the sharpness. It's even kind of reduced some of the dried fruit notes and brought out some of the more barley notes. I'm getting a little bit more biscuity notes now. it's not a bad whiskey. It's quite good. I mean, it's definitely something I'll have some more drams of. So the Amrut Peated is bottled at 46%, whereas the Fusion was at 50%. So on the nose, you're getting straight away sort of like a burnt wood, a little bit of like rubbery, sort of that sort of tyre, kind of burnt tyre. I can see where the Fusion now is coming in. You are getting some of those fruity notes, kind of, even though there's a bit of smoke, not heaps of smoke though, not quite like an Isla, quite soft. It's almost like a Bunnahabhain kind of dried fruit, just kind of like just there a little bit. It definitely still feels young. It's mainly in the front of the palate, not so much the mid. The finish is a lot shorter, interestingly, on this one. Considering smoky whiskies generally have long finishes, it's actually not as long as the Fusion for me. I mean, personally, I don't know what it's like for you. So to conclude, the Amrut Fusion is definitely one that I think, yeah, it's a decent whiskey. I would definitely have another dram of this. The Peated one, not so much. I feel like with all the nice Isla whiskies you can get, and I just don't know if I'd go back to that, and I'm quite a big Peat fan. But yeah, generally quite good. Good work, Amrut. And now, on to the next whiskey, which is the Paul John. Here we go, here is the Paul John whiskey. This whiskey is from the southwestern state of Goa, and it also uses the 6-row Indian barley from the north up in the Himalayas. And this version is the Brilliant. So the Brilliant's won some awards a few years ago, I can't remember exactly when or what. Integrity bottling, I mean, unchill filter, natural colour, 46%, but obviously no age statement because of just the nature of Indian single malt. It doesn't really work because of the hot climates. Oh, it's interesting those. I'm getting like a rubber, but not like tire kind of rubber. I'm getting like an eraser, you know, from in pencil sharpenings. And also there's sort of like a plasticky kind of note, sort of a paint note. It sort of reminds me of a rye a little bit. A little bit of fruit coming through, a little bit of lemon, and on the palate, it's quite sharp, this one. You definitely can get the youthfulness from this whiskey. Got some grassy flavours, a little bit of fruit, but yeah, the sharpness I can't really get past. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little bit of water. Yeah, that's much better with water. Yeah, wow. That's actually suddenly gone from like an average whiskey that I didn't really like to actually, that's all right. It's okay. Still sharp though, very bitter malt. It's not sweet really at all. Drop of sweetness, but that's mainly bitter. The finish is also decently long, but I don't know if I really like the finish. I think this is definitely one to warm up to and get my palate used to. It's a little bit different for me. It reminds me of some Australian whiskies I've had, which were also quite young. But the thing about Australian whiskies, they're often just so expensive. I don't know why they're so expensive. Why is Australian whiskey so expensive? Can some Australians tell me why your whiskey is just so expensive, even though when it's like so young and you get Scotch for so much cheaper? I think I prefer the Amrut over the Paul John. Especially the Fusion. I think Fusion's still in front for me. It's not bad. I mean, I guess if it's cheaper or something, maybe go for it. I'm not a massive fan. And now let's go on to the next whiskey, and that is the Rampur. Now, I know whiskey generally should be about the taste and the smell, not just the presentation, but for the value of whiskey, this was sort of under $100 in New Zealand. Like the presentation, you've got these sort of the rope around this like little bag. I mean, I just think that's such a nice little touch. And the fact they can do it and still keep their price point is part of the reason I wanted to do this Indian whiskey video. Like I've been wanting to do an Australian one, I've been wanting to do it on a Japanese one, but the whiskies are just so expensive. But the Indian ones have been pretty reasonable prices where I am. So a little bit about the Rampur. It is a single malt whiskey, again from India. It is a double cask, so it's aged in both ex-bourbon barrels and ex-sherry barrels, but you know, similar to like a Balvenie 12. And this is named after the small town, Rampur, which is in the northern state of Uttar Pradesh. Is that how you say it? I don't know. It's owned by the big drinks company, Radiko Kadatan. I mean, hopefully that's how you pronounce it. And they've been around for like half a century. Also, again, traditionally in traditional Indian whiskey, which is more like the malt and molasses. Whereas recently, as 2016, they've got into single malt whiskey. And the thing about this I'm curious about is I've read some places that a lot of places in India can't actually get hold of this whiskey. And what I'm curious is, if you're in India, like, have you seen this whiskey before? But apparently you can get it through duty-free stores if you really want it. But I hope that's not the case. I hope you do have availability to your own whiskey there. So I'm up to my final glass. Now that is a nice nose, this one. You're getting sort of like this dried pencil shaving, kind of woody notes, this sort of biscuity note. But cutting through all that, you're getting this really, really beautiful passion fruit and mango. A mango sort of sorbet kind of thing. Really interesting and really different to a lot of scotches, this one. Cheesecake, like, you know, on the top of it, I mean, maybe this is where the passion fruit thing comes up again. You know, that sort of glazed passion fruit icing on a cheesecake. The passion fruit, the creaminess, and then like the biscuity note from a cheesecake. I really like this nose. I really, really like it. And on the palate, oh wow. In New Zealand, we have a lot of places that do sort of brunch and like you get sort of French toast. On the French toast, often they put all sorts of things, maple syrup, banana, often like there's this passion fruit kind of dressing you can get often on top. And I'm kind of getting all that stuff. I mean, it reminds me of when I went to Samoa or Fiji and had sort of cocktails of pina coladas and all that sort of thing. That's what this is taking me back to. And then, you know, those sort of breakfasts where there's like a whole bunch of grapes and fruit and rock melon and all that sort of thing. It doesn't have the sharpness that the Paul John and the Amrut had as well. You're getting some creamy vanilla now on this one, on the palate. The finish is long. And it's a really enjoyable finish. It's not so much like the Paul John where I wasn't a huge fan of the finish. This one is like a really tasty, nice, lingering finish. Although I do know, like, my wife is not a huge fan of mangoes, not a huge fan of pineapple, and not a huge fan of passion fruit. So maybe this is like, if you like those fruits, if that's sort of your palate, I mean, this is probably the whiskey for you. This is very, very tasty. Let's just add a little bit of water. I mean, I'm not like tempted to add the water as much as the other two because I'm loving how it is right now, but let's just, in terms of experimentation, let's just put a little bit in. Let that sit for a bit. So far, I would say this whiskey is definitely my top, followed by the Amrut Fusion, then the Amrut Peated, and then probably the Paul John last for me. And that's personally, it's my personal opinion. Whiskey is so subjective. It's about your taste, your palate. This one's definitely standing out. This is the one I would recommend people look for. The wood has added a little bit of a sulphur note. The palate is still decently good. It has pulled some of that fruit away. It's become a little bit malty, a little bit more traditional fruits like apple and that sort of thing, as opposed to just the tropical fruits. The finish is shortened as well. So, I mean, for me personally, I actually think this whiskey might be better without a little drop of water, and maybe that's because this is bottled at 45%, the others were bottled at 46 and 50%. I'd love to see a bottle of this, maybe at cask strength. That would be quite interesting. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned a little bit about Indian whiskey, and it's been fantastic. And that's what's so great about the whiskey journey and so exciting about world whiskey at the moment. There's so many different alleyways you can take down and explore. And I'm glad I went down this alleyway. I'm glad I found this specific whiskey, the double cask Rampur, and definitely worth going down and trying. So if you enjoyed this video, make sure you give it a like. It helps the YouTube algorithm, it helps it reach more people, and it'll help me make more videos. I mean, I currently don't have a Patreon or any other way for supporting running this channel. The best thing you can do is right now, give the video a like. But above all, I hope that you share and enjoy. Beauty.